You're listening to 88.7 FM WRHU. This is the morning wake-up call. Today I'm sitting with Mackenzie Quick, an assistant professor of public relations at Flagler University, to discuss the impact that abortion will play on the Republican stance and on the voters' minds this upcoming presidential election. How big a role do you think abortion is going to play with this upcoming election?
We have seen movement from the state level. There's been a significant increase in state campaigns, specifically being led by pro choice organizations. We do have some states that have either affirmed rights, have expanded rights, or enshrined rights to abortion, including Vermont, Kansas, California, et cetera. So this November, we're seeing a continuation of states having this back and forth about their abortion access again on that state level. But there has been this desire and this call for codification of abortion rights at the federal level. I do find it ironic just today as we're speaking, Republicans in the Senate, they did again block legislation that would codify those reproductive rights nationwide. So there are measures that are being taken. They are just not being passed at that federal level. So for that reason, a lot of this frustration we're seeing primarily with liberally leaning or Democratic voters is, again, this desire for codification. So I think for that reason alone, abortion really is at the forefront of a lot of voters' minds as they go to the polls in November. So about a third of voters, they're claiming that they're only going to vote for a candidate that aligns with what their views are on abortion. And that's both from the Democratic perspective, but also the Republican perspective. And we've seen an increase in abortion as a voting concern since the 2020 election from both of those parties. So I really do think that this is going to be a deciding factor for a lot of voters as they approach November.
What type of effects do you think abortion will specifically play on Trump's presidential candidacy with his flip-flopping of opinions?
Yeah, he's kind of in a tricky spot as a Republican candidate. He is running as a Republican, and the regulation of abortion, or just like the outright banning of abortion, is largely supported by Republican voters. So he can't risk changing his stance and saying that he does support reproductive rights, because then he loses that massive voting block that really has supported him and won him the presidency in past elections. But he also can't be too vocally extreme in some of his policy proposals, because then he risks losing white suburban women. Abortion, reproductive rights is a huge issue that is really kind of steered by white suburban women. And at times that can be the voting block that is make or break for the Republican Party. So they are in that tricky spot, Donald Trump specifically, of having to balance these two populations that are really a huge determinant in winning the presidency. I think that we're also going to continue seeing this really intense scrutiny of Trump's reproductive rights as a result of how much social media chatter has been amplified as people are becoming more aware of the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. That's something that we've seen Trump make statements on through Truth Social, trying to kind of distance himself from that organization. So I think, especially over the coming months as we head into November, this is kind of going to be this balancing act that he's trying to keep multiple communities happy and not rock the boat too much and lose any votes.
Another thing that just recently happened was the Republican National Committee
Mhm.
unveiling that plan that left a lot of these decisions to the states, and it refused sort of an outright national ban, which prior to the Dobbs decision, historically, the Republicans were advocating for a national ban. What impact is that going to have on the overall Republican Party?
The 2020 Republican platform was virtually identical to the 2016 platform. And we now see in the 2024 platform this softening on the stance of abortion. And I think a lot of that is the Republican Party has seen through midterm elections and the popularity of some of these ballot measures how truly unpopular this stance is. It's kind of like that analogy of the dog that caught the car. Like they've been chasing after and after the banning of abortion or just anti abortion measures at large. And now that they had this success through the Dobbs ruling, they're kind of looking at themselves like, well, what now, you know? So I do think that the softening of this stance, it's kind of a way for Trump and the Republican Party from a federal perspective to punt the ball, so to say, to state governors and to state legislative bodies so that they can avoid ownership of that issue.
So why has
Mhm.
it taken the modern Republican Party so long to actually formulate some kind of policy?
I can only make assumptions because we have no idea what's going on behind closed doors. But within the Republican Party itself, you have quite the spectrum of ideologies that are coming into play. So we have some representatives, some senators who are extremely staunchly conservative and taking these really extreme positions when it comes to anti abortion measures. We also have Republicans who are running as more centrist candidates. All right. And so we're having to come up with policy positions that are going to be agreeable to this spectrum of leaders or politicians. So it's very much so that balancing act because we definitely need to consider that some of these representatives, some of these politicians, they're up for reelection. So we need to be cognizant of those who are running in more purple states that, again, we need to be retaining those representatives from a Republican standpoint. And if they're in purple states, they might have those more centrist views. You also still need to cater to those more extreme conservative values that some constituents are calling on their leaders to represent.
So in states like Kansas, there was an overwhelming decision to keep abortion legal within the state through a ballot measure, despite the state being quite a Republican stronghold. My question kind of lies in what does that overwhelming support for abortion rights in even red states mean for the Republicans who have thus far been very supportive of banning abortion at a statewide level?
So I would say again, similar to the RNC at large, a softening on that stance. And I think what is coming into play with a lot of these state-led ballot measures is there is this contradiction between the Republican Party's emphasis on limited government, but also this desire to regulate or restrict reproductive care. So from the state level, we've seen a lot of these pro-choice organizations really capitalizing on framing that messaging in favor of expanding reproductive access, pointing to the Republican Party or the conservative ideology as overreaching with government power, right? Because we can point out, the Republican Party claims to be this party that really emphasizes individual rights and doesn't want government intervention. But at the same time, these anti abortion legislative measures are exactly that. And that's especially what we saw happen in Kansas. I actually have a study that I did with my co author, Josh Bramlett, about the Kansas ballot measures. And what we found to be the case, just from our own expertise, from our own observation, is that Kansans for Constitutional Freedom, they were the pro choice organization that was connected to this ballot measure. They were really able to connect with Kansan voters through framing traditional conservative Kansan pride, loyalty, and values, specifically through the framing of anti abortion ballot measures as the antithesis of conservative priorities. So we saw this in comparisons, especially to COVID mask mandates. So it's an interesting alignment between what is, like you've mentioned, a traditionally Democratic issue with traditionally Republican issues. But by being able to point to this contradiction, we're seeing a lot of states that are traditionally Republican in their stances supporting these pro choice amendments and, again, enshrinement of abortion access.
And is there anything further on this topic that you feel is important to discuss surrounding abortion, the Republican ticket?
I would say just the importance in voting. We have this notion that we've heard again and again with every election cycle of this is the most important election. And that can be incredibly exhausting. But despite the fact that we do have two moderately unpopular candidates, this election does really have a lot of implications for the future. Court appointments, especially the Supreme Court, they do have consequences. It's very possible that if Donald Trump had not won in 2016, we would not be sitting here speaking about abortion. Donald Trump's directly responsible for now one third of the Supreme Court. And, in addition to the Supreme Court, the packing of conservative justices and judges at lower levels. Our vote is our voice, and I think it's incredibly important to use it because we are looking at potential retirements on the horizon with Supreme Court justices, and that could either be expanding conservative stronghold on the Supreme Court, or it could be, evening the scales a little bit between conservative leaning and liberal leaning justices.
Thank you to Mackenzie Quick for that interview. For 88.7 FM's Morning Wake Up Call, I'm Cameron Bowden, WRHU.